Do I really need grammar to learn a language? To answer this question, let's first change the wording slightly and ask ourselves a related question. Do we really need grammar to use a language? That is, to communicate effectively? I think you would probably agree with me that the central aim of using language is to exchange meaningful messages with other language users. Now, various subsystems of a language, for example, vocabulary, pronunciation, but also grammar, work together to make language meaningful and thus contribute to communicating messages with other members of our speech community. Let's look at the role played by grammar by taking the question we are addressing. Do I really need grammar to learn a language? Now, if we remove the grammar from this sentence, we end up with a string of words. Really, need, grammar, learn, language. Which doesn't make much sense, does it? In order to give these words meaning, we need, for example, to use an auxiliary verb do to show that we are asking a question. We need the pronoun I, so it is clear who we are referring to. We need the indefinite article to show that we are talking about language in general, as opposed to a particular language. Of course, it's true that people with a very restricted knowledge of a language do sometimes manage to get the message across with little or no grammar. For example, a famous first meeting in the jungle of Africa apparently began with the utterance, "Me Tarzan, you Jane." Now, this may be okay for a first meeting, but I think Tarzan would have needed to learn a bit more grammar if his relationship with Jane was to develop. I think it's fairly obvious then that people need a certain amount of grammar in order to use a language effectively. But this does not mean that your grammar needs to be perfect. Everyone, including myself, gets their grammar wrong from time to time when communicating in a foreign language. In many cases, making grammatical mistakes will often not impede communication and the transmission of messages. It's probably true to say that there is a tendency by some teachers to place undue emphasis on grammatical correctness. What I like to call the myth of perfection can be demotivating and inhibit learners in their attempts to communicate. So, what about our actual question? Do I really need grammar to learn as opposed to use a language? What is usually behind this question is, does grammar need to be consciously learnt by learners and explicitly taught by teachers? Now, of course, it's true that when babies and infants learn their first language, they gradually acquire the grammatical system of this language without any kind of formal instruction. For centuries, there have been claims by linguists and methodologists to have discovered so-called grammarless teaching methods, which aim to mirror the way in which infants acquire their first language. But these methods ignore the enormous differences between infants and, say, secondary school learners. For example, as far as their cognitive development or the conditions under which they learn a language are concerned. Nowadays, most serious researchers agree that certain kinds of grammatical instruction can support and accelerate the learning of languages. And this leads us to a final, very important question. What kinds of grammatical instruction best support learning? In the past, there has been a tendency among many teachers and textbooks to focus too much on teaching the grammatical system in rather traditional ways, as if it were a kind of mathematics. That is to say, by analyzing grammar, getting students to memorize rules, testing this knowledge with fill-in-the-gap exercises, and so on. However, there are more communicative ways of approaching the teaching of grammar. For example, if we give learners grammar activities that do not simply test out their knowledge of rules, but provide the kind of tasks that require learners to express their own ideas, feelings, and needs, that is to say, to use grammar for a communicative purpose, then learning grammar can be both effective and a lot of fun.